Ladies and gentlemen, this is Harry Lassaniziris, and welcome to my grecochess YouTube channel. And we're going to continue now with the 79th chessanity tournament, round number 2. In the previous video, if you watched it, you saw that I won my first game. I have 1 point in one game, and now you're going to see what happened in round number 2. But first, let's once again give a look at the tournament announcement. You're going to see here the announcement with 4 rated sections. I'm eligible only for the U2000 because my rating is 1554. And for this section, there are 3 rounds, meaning every player needs to play 3 games. And the time control is G50, D5, meaning players have 50 minutes for the entire game. When the game starts, their clock is set to 50 minutes. And when it's the time to move, for the first 5 seconds, it doesn't move, and then it goes downwards. Players need to complete all their moves before the clock goes down to 0, because otherwise they lose out of time, no matter how wonderful is their position. Another small detail that is not mentioned but is well known in tournaments: if you have 5 minutes remaining, 5 or less, you don't need to continue writing your moves, because at that point, every second counts, and the time that you waste in writing your moves can be crucial. Once again, let me show you the location. That is how it looks from the outside the elementary school at Jericho. And now how it looks from the inside. That is how it looks from the inside. This is the cafeteria where the tournament games take place. This is in fact half of the cafeteria. In fact, I was playing my games at the other half, but it looks exactly the same. And I'd like once again to thank the organizers for making available both the boards and the clocks and setting up the clocks in advance. And this made the job of the chess players much, much easier. We didn't need to worry about boards and clocks, only about our games. And before we start, my opponent. My opponent is Daniel Cuba. His rating is 1331, and he is in the 78.1 percentile, meaning that his rating is better than 78.1% of the United States Chess Federation members. Compare this to mine. My rating is 1554, and I'm in the 85.8 percentile. What does this mean? It means that in theory, in paper, I'm the favorite. I'm slightly better than him as far as numbers are concerned, but this doesn't mean too much. What is important is what will actually happen in the chessboard. And we're going now to see in the chessboard how the game took place. I'm going to show you move by move with my comments and my thoughts. On the right half of the board, you're going to see the computer evaluation. If you see a plus, it means that the computer thinks white is better. If you see a minus, it thinks that black is better. And I'm having the white pieces, which of course means I'm starting first. And starting with my e pawn that goes to e4, Daniel moves his c pawn from c7 to c6, and this is known in theory as the Caro-Kann defense because it was pioneered by 2 great chess players. Their last names are Caro and Kann. You see them here. They lived more than 100 years ago. Second move, I move my pawn from d2 to d4. He replies, Daniel, by moving his pawn to d5. You see, book move meaning that they are well known in theory and they have been analyzed exhaustively. There are volumes written about them. Now I take his pawn, his d5 pawn, and he takes also my d5 pawn, and now it becomes the exchange variation, Caro-Kann defense exchange variation. Move number 4, I move my bishop to d3. that's what you do in the first few moves. You try to develop your pieces. And develop means you take them away from the starting positions and you put them in places where they occupy, or in fact, they control the center. Daniel moves his knight to c6 and not only threatens my pawn at d4, this is bad enough, he also threatens, if I defend this pawn, to come to d4 and apply pressure on my bishop on d3 and the square at c2. And to stop him from having any such ideas, I move my pawn from c2 to c3. Daniel now develops his other knight, sends it to f6. I develop my dark-colored bishop. I put it to f4. And Daniel develops his knight, sends it to g4, and not only develops his bishop, but also threatens my queen. And I cannot take the bishop because then the knight will take my queen. I stop this threat with the interference. I place the knight f3 between his bishop and my queen, but of course the knight is pinned. He moves his pawn from e7 to e6 to open the road to his dark colored bishop. And now I move my other knight from b1 to d2. Why do I do it? Because the knight on f3 is pinned, which means I cannot move it or else I lose my queen. But I also cannot move my queen. I could not move my queen because then Daniel would just take the knight at f3. I would take back with my g-pawn and I would have double isolated pawns along the f file, which is a very bad pawn structure. And in addition, my king would be quite exposed. But now with my knight on d2, I don't have to worry because if he takes my knight on f3, I take it back not with my queen, but with my other knight. And my queen is free to go anywhere it's needed. Daniel replies by developing his dark-colored bishop, sending it to d6, and threatens my bishop at f4. If I'm not careful and I forget about it, I could easily lose the bishop and my situation would be very difficult. I need either to move my bishop, defend it, or take Daniel's bishop, and that's what I actually do. I take his bishop, and he takes it back with his queen. Now that my queen is free, it goes to b3. Why? Because I'm threatening the b7 pawn, and of course Daniel is going to see it. I'm not expecting him to give it away and let me attack the rook at a8, but he will need to spend a move defending the b7 pawn instead of any attack elsewhere. Many attacks, if they are well planned, they may not immediately yield a result, but at least they'll stop the opponent from carrying on their own plans. But of course, one needs to be careful to make sure that you are not in a worse position if the opponent defends. So he places his queen on c7. We're both going to castle now. And we've more or less completed the development. Now I'm going to move my rook from f1 to e1. The reason I'm doing so is because at f1 the rook was very passive. It only would move along the first rank, but now it starts fighting for the semi-open e file. It's called semi-open because there's only one pawn there from the black side, nothing from the white side. And ideally you want your rooks to control completely open files, but semi-open is the second best possible choice. Daniel will not let me, so he's going to move his rook to e8. And now I'm going to move my other rook to c1 because I wanted to stare at his queen. Currently, there's my pawn and his knight between the rook and the queen, but if for any reason they disappear, then I'll have a strong attack. Daniel is afraid my bishop will go to b5 and big change with his knight at c6 and weaken his pawns. That's why he wants to stop it by moving his pawn from a7 to a6. Now, until now, I'm moving more or less by default, usually going with theory or the best moves, or at least good moves, and that is why a difference is quite small. From now on, I start my attacking plan. I move my pawn from c3 to c4. Computer thinks it's inaccuracy, that's why from a small plus, I reach a small minus. Computer would like Daniel to take my pawn at c4, as you see, but by doing so, he loses control over the e4 square. Of course, I'm going to take back his pawn is not central any longer and he doesn't like it. That is why he decides to move his rook to b8 and do what I did to him, meaning if my rook on c1 stares to his queen at c7, his rook at b8 stares at my queen at b3. Now I'll start taking. I take his pawn on d5 and he takes it back with his knight. And now the bishop on g4 is not defended any longer because the knight from f6 moved to e5. So I move my knight to e5 and attack the bishop. And he cannot even take my knight with his knight because then I'm grabbing the queen. So what Daniel decided to do is take my undefended pawn at d4, which the computer thinks is a mistake and gives me a huge advantage, but only if I play correctly. And correctly, the computer would want me to put my queen either to a4 or to c4. But that's not what I do. Instead, my rook from c1 takes his queen on c7, and he's going to, and the computer thinks this is a miss, because now his knight will take my queen at b3. I'm taking back the knight because otherwise I lose my knight. And he takes my rook. Finally, I take his bishop. So the combination is over. I'm still a little bit ahead, 0.59 as you see. Of course, that I could have been almost near 3 had I played correctly before. Have I placed my queen on a4 or c4? I'm still a little ahead. Then what is the situation? I have 2 extra pieces, minor pieces, and Daniel has an extra rook and a pawn. From the mathematics of pieces, because 3 plus 3 is 6, each minor piece is 3 pawns, 3 plus 3 is 6, while the rook is 5 and the pawn is 1, 5 plus 1, 6. It seems that it's equal, but in reality, in most cases, it's better to have 2 minor pieces than a rook and a pawn. That is what I was hoping. That is what I achieved. By doing so, I missed my chance to do something even better. But let's see how the game will continue. Daniel will place his rook from e8 to d8. And now I need to defend my bishop. How? I could defend it with placing my knight either c5 or c1 or my rook to e3 or d1. The problem with defending with pieces is that if the piece is attacked and has to move, then you lose the original one that was defended. So I would prefer to move my bishop. But where? If I put it to e4, pin. f7, pawn goes to f5, and I lose one of my 2 pieces. Cannot put it to b5. I decided to put it on e2, so what is safe for now, and just in case the rook on e1 supports it. And the computer really thinks it's the best. Daniel replies by moving his knight from c7 to b5, and the knight is ready to come to the center and ready to create havoc to my position. When humans face each other, there's a difference. If machines play with each other, they know always what is the perfect plan, and they know always if the knight can create havoc or not. But with humans, you never know. Knights, when may arrive where you least expect them, create all kind of crazy forks, and before you know it, you can easily lose a lot of material. Just one careless moment and the opponent takes advantage of the knight. And to avoid any such possibility, especially when later we'll have much less time, I decided to remove his knight. And not only I remove his knight, but I also created what are called isolated double pawns for Daniel on the b file. What does it mean? It means that black has 2 pawns on b7 and b5 on the same file, no pawns on A on C. So there is no pawn to come to defend them. If I attack them, only with his pieces he can defend them. Now, my next move. I move my pawn from h2 to h3. Why? First, I defend my knight, even if it's not attacked now. In the future, it could be attacked and perhaps could be a double threat, and my knight could be in danger. But in addition, I create what is called Luft for my king. Luft, Luft, is a German word that means air. This means that if black can land the rook on the first rank and check my king, then my king has an escape square on h2. Many games have been decided because one of the two sides did not have the loot for their king, and they either were checkmated when they didn't expect it, or they had to give up a lot of material to avoid such a scenario. Or they had, for example, here's my rook, it could go elsewhere and win material, but it can't because the king is exposed. But by moving my pawn from h2 to h3, I avoid such a possibility in the future. And one better do this well ahead of time and not at the last moment. Daniel replies the same way. He creates loop for his own king from h7 to h6, so we know the game is not going to be over due to a back-rank chessmate. Now that my king is safe, let's develop or let's give a better spot for my knight. From g4 goes to the e5, is in the center, controls 8 squares. But Daniel doesn't like it, moves his pawn from f7 to f6. Temporarily, he's going to move my knight, but he's going to create a hole on g6, where my knight can go and not be attacked by any of his pawns. This is why one needs to be careful when advancing pawns to attack knight. If my knight had nowhere to go, and this was a final blow, yes. But now my knight, out of the 8 possible squares, has 3 squares where it's safe. And let's count them. No, 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 yes, 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 so yes, 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 no, no. So out of the 8 possible squares, 5 are no, meaning if I go there, I lose my knight, while 3 are yes, the knight is safe. And out of these 3 squares, I choose g6. Near the king, controls the f8 and e7 squares. So Daniel needs to do something about it. That's why he attacks my knight by sending his king from g8 to f7. My knight goes back to f4. And Daniel pushes his pawn from e6 to e5. Now, this is, I really believe, a very good move. It's the best on the computer because it does not just attack my knight that will move either way or other, but first of all, it creates a pawn chain, as it's called, meaning 3 pawns, g7, 7, f6, and e5, each supporting the other. Second, it controls the d4 square that is in the center. And third, it gives more space to Daniel. My knight is going to move once again, and is going to go now all the way down to e2. And if you count it correctly, my knight moved 4 times in the last 4 moves. Daniel now attacks my a pawn, moves his rook from b8 to a8. How to defend the a2 pawn? Of course, I could put my rook on a1 or move one of my knights either to c1 or to c3, but this makes the pieces very passive. Instead of the pieces being able to attack or do anything else important, they have to stay defending a pawn. Especially if I put my knight on c3, the pawn immediately goes to b4, knight goes away, and pawn is lost. And that is why I defend the pawn by moving it from a2 to a3. That is the advantage of having pawns next to each other. It can support the other one. Daniel moves his rook to d3. Quite a good move because although the computer judges this based on a perfect play, which only machines can do, but when humans face each other, things are not exactly the same. Humans think in a different way. What is happening here is that, first of all, he attacks my knight at b3, but second, of course, I'm going to move my knight or defend in some way. Second, what's going to happen is that his rook is deep inside my defense on the 3rd rank, and it's good if you can safely place a piece deep in your opponent's territory. And I reply by making a fork. knight goes from b3 to c5. It attacks both the pawn on b7 and the rook on d3. And Daniel cannot place his rook on d7 to defend the pawn because then the rook is also lost. Instead, since the b7 pawn is lost, he moves his rook down to d2 and attacks my b2 pawn. This pawn is lost. If I move it to b4, for example, the a3 is lost. And if I move my rook to b1 to defend it, then I lose my knight on e2. And since I'm going to lose a pawn either way or other, why not take the other pawn on b7? I take it, he takes my pawn. And yes, it's a pawn for a pawn, but that's why you see now the numbers become minus. Daniel got rid of his doubled pawns. And after he takes it, I move my knight from e2 to c3. First, it does not depend any longer on the rook to defend it. And second, it attacks the pawn on b5. You may think, so what? Rook will take the knight. Yes, but then the other rook, the other knight goes to d6. It's a fork, attacks both king and rook, and the rook is lost. And that is why knights can be very tricky chess pieces. And both me and Daniel have to think of all these possibilities every move we played, and there are countless of them, and really, I need to tell you, it's mentally exhausting. You always hope that the opponent might miss something, but let's see what Daniel did. First of all, he realized that his b pawn was lost, and he moves it down to b4, so I take the pawn, he takes the pawn, his rook. At this point, there are no queens pawns left any longer. The remaining pawns are on the king's side. Daniel has 4, I have 3, but none of them is passed. And also I have 2 extra knights for a rook, and 2 extra knights for a rook plus a pawn that is not passed is usually something good. Not extremely important, not decisive yet, at least not at a level, but you see, I'm in the plus. Now I need to save my knight on b7. And to do it so by gaining a tempo, I check, king goes to e6. And now the knight goes to e4. Not too many squares to go. I don't think there's anywhere else to go. No matter where, it's lost, it's lost, it's lost, it's lost. No, no. And e4, yes, it's attacked by the rook, but it's defended twice, both by the other knight and by my rook. And it's good to have 2 knights at this shape defending each other. So if one is attacked, it can be defended by the other. And Daniel moves his rook from a8 to c8. And both of these rooks attack both of my knights, but if any rook takes one of my knights, the other knight will take his rook. I feel safe. That's why I moved now my rook from e1 to d1, looking for a check at the d6 and starting a very dangerous attack. The computer says it's a blunder, and you're going to see why. In fact, I'll explain it now because Daniel did not immediately play this move. If he moves his pawn from f6 to f5, knight at e4 needs to move, and the moment it's moved, the other knight at c3 is lost. And that is why I'm the minus 2.23. But Daniel is not going to see. He played the third best possible move. Rook goes from c8 to c6. And I avoid the danger. That is why it's a miss. And what I needed to do now is move my pawn to g4 to stop his pawn from coming to f5. I had seen the danger from f5. I did not see that I could defend with g4. I was very pessimistic. I missed his defense. Instead, I moved my rook from d1 to d3 to give extra support to this knight. He moves his rook from b4 to c4. The situation is that he attacks my knight twice. I defended twice, once with my rook and once with my other knight. And if only he could move again, he could move his pawn to f5, remove this knight, and win my other knight. I still had one last chance to move my pawn to g4 and stop the pawn from going to f5. But unfortunately, I missed it. I was so pessimistic I was going to lose my knight, so I said, okay, let's go here and attack the pawn at g7. Let's take back something. Which not happened because Daniel moved his pawn to g5. And now I cannot even play g4 because the rook is covering the g3. I move my rook to e3 to give the maximum protection to the two knights, but too little too late. Daniel moves his pawn to f5, and what I was afraid actually happened. I am in the minus by more than minus 0.1, no matter what. I'm going to lose a piece, but I thought, well, if I'm going to lose a piece, let's take back whatever we can. If you take a pawn for a piece, especially near the end, one perhaps could exchange everything and end up having a pawn while your opponent has a piece, and they cannot checkmate you with a piece. If anything, you may have a chance if you can promote that pawn. That is why I'm taking the pawn with a check. Daniel takes it back. Computer thinks it's a terrible move, because I ended up being now minus 3.79, almost minus 4, like game number 1, where in the opening at some point it was down minus 4. Down meaning by 4, it was plus 4 for the opponent because he get the white. I was 4 points down, but I ended up winning it. But could the same miracle happen here? Who knows? Now it's near the end, not so easy. My knight goes from c3 to e2 now. At least let's save the other knight. We lost one, not lose both. It would be terrible. Daniel attacks it. Rook goes to c2. But the moment he did it, I smiled. Because that was the wrong move. And you're going to see why. When you're down, no matter how much, you should always think how to come back. And think what mistake could possibly your opponent do. Because the reason I put my knight on e2 is not only not to lose it, but because now the knight could potentially make a check with a fork. Let's see before how was the case at c4. Now I will minus 4.09 because I'm down a piece, even though I don't even have an extra pawn. I'm down, not exactly a piece, I'm down what's called the exchange. Down the exchange, meaning that only theoretically, if I could exchange the one pair of rooks and all the pawns with rook versus knight, it's a theoretical draw, assuming you defend correctly. But with my knight here, if the rook was not here, it could check the king. Not only that, it would be a fork to take the other rook. But this would only happen if Daniel did not play correctly. And after so long time of playing, we were both exhausted. It's very easy to miss things. And what I was hoping actually happened. Daniel moved his rook from c4 to c2, and this was the answer to my prayers. The moment I saw that, without thinking too much, immediately my knight goes to d4, check. The pawn cannot take it because of the pin. King goes to d5, and I take the rook on my only choice I had. Daniel takes it back with the rook, not with the king, because then he also loses the e5 pawn. And now we reach the ending with a rook and 3 pawns each of us. Pawns connected to each other. His pawns are a little bit more advanced than mine. They already reached the middle of the board. Mine are still in the beginning. And let's see what's going to happen. Of course, I have a psychological advantage because I just pull off the miracle, and Daniel may be a little bit depressing how easily the win was lost from his hands, a sure win. I move my rook to g3, attacking his pawn. Of course, I'm not going to get it, but I'm going to force Daniel to defend it instead of attacking me in any other way. I'm going to d3 check. Daniel sends his king to e6. Rook goes to a3. hoping for a steward. I would be very lucky if Daniel would move either his king to d6 or his rook to h6. Then I would win the rook with a steward. Well, that did not happen. Instead, he started pushing his pawn to g4. I still steward. His king has only one square to go, f7, which actually happens. And now we exchange rooks. Now each of us has 3 pawns, and it's a very, I would say, crazy situation. Which side, if any, can win? It depends on a lot of Zugzwangs, oppositions, and very deep theory of pawn endings, which we had very little time to do it, to think about it, and we didn't know what was going to happen. But I decided to exchange the pawns. The reason being that now my 2 pawns are connected. I have 1 pawn island, Daniel has 2, and usually the fewer pawn islands you have, the better. So let's reach this position, and then we can think about it. Now we are both much less than 5 minutes. We stopped recording the moves, and unfortunately the remaining few more were lost because we had no time to write them down. And what happened later is, with 2 minutes to go, Daniel offered me a draw. I took a few minutes to think about it. It was a case that you needed to know extremely well the theory, and I had no idea if I was winning, losing, or a draw. But even if theoretically I was winning, there was no time to figure it out in less than 2 minutes. And that is why I agreed to the draw. And we're going now to go through the game review to see what does the computer say about the game, at least until the point I recorded it. And let's go now to the review. The computer of chess.com believes that Daniel was more accurate than me at 85.6 versus 84.8 for me. And also Daniel played as if he was better rated. Gestailo would give Daniel a rating of 2300, mine would be 2250. But I had a brilliant move. And in great moves, Daniel was better, 4 versus 1. We both had 17 best moves. I had 9 versus 7, excellent. We both had the first 7 moves were book moves. In accuracies, I had 3 versus 1. Mistakes, they made 2 versus 1. We both had 2 misses and 2 blunders. Hence, at this point, once the game was over and we had agreed on the draw, I wrote down the final position to analyze to the computer. And this is the position that we finally reached. And I'm going now to share it with you so we can both go to see what would have happened if we had not agreed on the draw. First of all, let me clear the board. Set a position, yes. Clear the board. And now we start placing up, in fact, I start placing the pieces as I recorded them. My king was on e2, and I had 2 pawns on f2 and on g3. And Daniel had his king on f5, and his 2 pawns on e5 and g4. Load. And as you see, it is 0.00, completely equal. And let's go to the table base. Today, if there are less than 7 pieces remaining, or 7 or fewer pieces remaining, the situation has been completely analyzed by computers, best possible play. The way to do it is there is enough space in the computer memory to have one bit for every position and connect them depending on if there is a legal move that goes from the one to the other, so they can calculate exactly under a perfect ending what would have happened. So let's go to the table base now. The table base says that it is a draw. It's a draw if white plays any of these moves here, and any other move could be a loss. But you see, there are 8 different possibilities. So there's no way I could have won the game if I insisted. The game ends in a draw, and after 2 rounds, both Daniel and me, we have 1.5 points, and after a few minutes of rest, we would continue for round number 3. I'd like, of course, to thank Daniel for this wonderful game. As you see, both of us played, most of our moves were decent moves and some were great. There were very few mistakes, but this decided the game. Daniel made one mistake near the middle when I could have been quite a lot of material up. Then my mistake was not to take advantage of that. I made then a second mistake when we had the rooks and the knights and allowed one of my knights to get lost. But after that, Daniel made another mistake with allowed me with the fork to get back. But other than that, I believe we played a great game. I'd like to thank Daniel for that, congratulate him for his performance and overall on being at the very top of the chess. As you saw, he's in a very high percentile. Round number 3 is over. With 1.5 points in 2 rounds, I'm ready for round number 3. And I'm optimistic that I may end up with a very good placement. But did this happen or not? Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for watching this video, round number 2. Thanks to the subscribers and also thanks to the viewers. Your comments are always welcome. And later on, I'm going to show to you what happened in round number 3. This is Harilaos Aneziris, the Greco channel, 79th Chessanity Chess Tournament. Goodbye.